All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the second EER seminar of the academic year. We're really excited to host our speaker today. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to remind everyone that EER has adopted some EER seminar guidelines for those of you in the room. They are available via a QR code if you scan what is on the tables. And Dr. Johnson is also putting it into the chat right now as well for our participants who are on Zoom. So again, I'm really pleased to welcome you all to the EER seminar for this month. So we have the honor of hosting Dr. Joe Mirabelli, who is a postdoc. Is a postdoc working in our research group in the Thrive Lab here at the University of Michigan. So Joe has a background in engineering physics. I was also an instructor for several years and did his master's in physics, and then proceeded to complete his doctorate degree at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I had the pleasure of meeting him and getting to work with him as a graduate student and now a postdoc. Joe received his doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Illinois and has been a postdoc here with us at the University of Michigan for the last 2 years. And we're really excited to hear his talk today. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you very much. All right, well, hello, everyone. I love all of the flannel and sweaters. We're finally getting to fall weather. It's very cozy. We're all kind of on this side of the room. I like that quite a lot. And hello, everyone on the Zoom. So I'm going to be talking about some research that started while I was a doctoral student. It actually became the focus of my dissertation, and I worked on it during my first year as a postdoc here as well. It is about stress for doctoral students in engineering, which I think everyone here, regardless of if you're currently or formerly a doctoral student in engineering or not, can relate to. So we're going to talk about it a little bit, and a new measure that I developed as a PhD student, and some ideas that I have for using it henceforth. I think we're clicked onto the Zoom. There we are. And I have about 4 stages of the presentation. And at the end of each stage, except for the first, I'll pause for a second and collect a question or two, and I'll do some at the end as well. But sometimes I think when you're going through a study and things are fresh, folks might want to ask a question in the middle. I'm totally okay with that, but otherwise I won't pause so that I can kind of truck through each of these sections. I'll be talking about 2 related studies. They're actually part of the same grant, and then a little bit about some of the other work that I've done. And to give a full disclaimer, well, let me start really quickly by saying my funding sources. This is from the National Science Foundation. The PI was my doctoral advisor, Jennifer Cromley. Karen was also a co-PI, and we had help from Liz Litzler at the University of Washington, who was our evaluator. I worked on these projects both as a graduate student at Illinois, as well as a postdoc in the Thrive Lab at Michigan. And so what I want to disclaim really quick is that I am on the faculty job hunt. And so in addition to questions, as I talk about this presentation, if you want to share any feedback, which could include in the Zoom chat, I am completely happy to hear that, as well as questions you have about the research. This is going to be a prototype for the job talk that I give when hopefully I'm invited to do some interviews in the future. So I want to get started by telling you a little bit about myself. I haven't had the pleasure to meet everybody in the department yet, so I thought this is a great time to introduce myself. Like Karen said, I got my bachelor's in engineering physics from the University of Illinois in 2016. I was an experimental particle physicist. I worked with the Tevatron collaboration at Fermilab National Accelerator Laboratory. I went on to the University of Indiana at Bloomington to earn my master's. And while I was there, I came in a cohort of about 25 people. And by the end of my second year, there were 12 people left. And I thought this was a huge issue. We had all of the horror stories that you've seen in graduate student dropout kind of unfolding at the same time. There were people whose spouses couldn't find jobs in the area. There were folks with pretty serious mental health concerns. We had somebody fail out on the qualifying exam, which the department kind of didn't communicate well to us. And we had folks with some really serious advisor issues and stress. I went to my department chair, I went to my advisor, and I told them both I was interested in looking into this. I was told that that was not a path towards being a respected scholar in physics, and so I joined the folks who dropped out as well. In the interim, as I tried to figure out what to do, I taught at a community college at Parkland in Champaign, returned to my home in Illinois, and I taught astronomy, physics, and earth sciences, and that's where I met my doctoral advisor, Jennifer Cromley, in educational psychology. I joined that program and earned my PhD there about a year and a half ago, and since then I've been a postdoc here at Michigan. The reason I bring all of this up is that it's really background for my study. My own experiences are a background for my study on graduate student stress and retention. And when I wanted to start researching this, I really didn't know much about it. And so I really wanted to start from the ground, not just by looking at the literature, but grounding myself in what the experiences of graduate students when it comes to their stress is. And as I started to get exposed in my first year of social sciences grad school, which was very different from physics, I really thought that qualitative approaches were going to be my answer for how I could understand how a very broad and diverse group of students across different engineering programs, some of which I was more or less familiar with, experience stress and ideas about retention, persistence, or attrition. So let me start with a little bit of literature. I'll go pretty quick through this, but I'm sure you're all aware there is what is being described as a mental health crisis in higher education. At the PhD level, about a third of all PhD students are reported to develop or experience psychological distress or psychological diagnoses during their study. That rate has been estimated in the United States to be about 6 times that of the baseline population. We've also heard all about counseling centers being overburdened, increased staff requirements, and also these issues in general kind of worsening as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In engineering specifically, students actually have a little bit more stress levels, but are pretty comparable with other disciplines, but they are much less likely to seek professional support, including university counseling services. And these issues are generally increased for students of marginalized backgrounds. Specifically, there's quite a lot of research in the engineering stress culture literature regarding the experiences of Black students, of women, students of LGBT identities, and also for first-generation students. Attrition, we have very similar things going on. Nationally, there is a high rate of attrition, but it's actually a little bit challenging to estimate. One reason, you can see it on my third bullet, is that mastering out is not always counted well in the graduate student literature. Let me give myself as an example. At Indiana, I mastered out, so I took a master's degree and I left. They counted me as graduating, so I was graduate data because I left with a degree, although that was not my intended terminal degree. So though these estimates say that about half of all PhD students in the United States depart their programs early, this may actually be undercounting dropout, which is quite alarming. In engineering, the numbers are actually a little bit better. I've seen estimates that are closer in the 30 to 40% range, but I still think that that is a pretty unacceptably high number. Finally, research focusing on graduate student mental health in general has only been reviewed a couple of times, has only been conducted by a small number of groups across the country, and so there is a real need there. I want to talk for a second about the role of stress. There is interconnection between stress, between other psychiatric symptoms and disorders like generalized anxiety disorders, like depression spectrum disorders and other personality and mood disorders. High stress has been linked to attrition and to the development of these psychiatric symptoms, and also psychological distress and attrition have been linked together. So these three phenomena are all very tightly linked together. In engineering programs, a culture of high stress is a newer construct that actually Karen and I have worked on a lot together here at Michigan. And this culture of stress has been reported by both undergraduate and graduate students, in which high stress situations are normalized. Behaviors that diminish self-care, like pulling all-nighters or toxic overwork, bragging about the number of clubs or extracurriculars or projects that you're researching on or internships that you have, very common, and high stress levels are considered a normal part of the engineering experience. So I would like to identify that, and to do that, I wanted to do research characterizing top stressors across a broad population of graduate engineers. One important thing I noticed as I reviewed the literature on graduate student stressors, a lot of papers pick one population or one stressor and they try to focus in on that. But one research question that I had as I approached this is, across a broad population, at what time and for who are different stressors at the top causing the most distress and the most issue at various points throughout the program? For that reason, we wanted to do qualitative work across a broad group of students. We needed some theoretical backgrounds that were sufficiently broad as well. Before I get into that, I want to quickly define stress and stressors. For the purposes of our study, the work that I've done over the last couple of years, we've used these definitions on screen for stress and stressors. I want to highlight that these are not intended to be used in a clinical sense. But stress we defined as an emotional response to a stimulus. This would be something that impacts someone's engagement with a source of stress, and we define stressors as sources of stress. One important note about a source of stress, it could be within the self. So if I'm ruminating about my own efficacy or maybe my own career intentions and direction, that might be something totally internalized, or it could be reinforced by external factors, like something my advisor said to me. We tried to characterize these sources of stress based on where students said they were coming from. And although in the broad stress literature, stress can have a lot of responses, including physical or motivational symptoms, and also positive or negative symptoms like increased motivation or decreased energy, we mostly focused on negative emotional experiences in this project. The other thing I want to highlight is that we operationalized a workplace model of stress in this study because grad school is a workplace. And here's the evidence that I have for that. It is very, very closely analogous to a workplace in which most graduate students, especially in engineering, are completing work for pay, especially in the institutions that I sampled for this study. A lot of times there are industry or corporate sponsors. There's also government sponsors. Typically there's project deadlines. There's meeting with these groups. Milestones are somewhat analogous to a promotion process, and in fact, at many institutions, once you become a candidate, your pay actually increases, so it is very much like getting promoted. Other students work with you in a lab. This is just like coworkers, as you share a supervisor, the advisor. The advisor is a little bit unlike a lot of conventional workplaces in that they control your pay, a lot of HR, and a lot of direct supervisor roles all simultaneously. So there's a little bit more of a complicated, deeper relationship between student and advisor. Given these facts, we operationalized a framework called the Job Hindrance Control Support Model. This theoretical framework comes from the workplace literature, but it has been used widely and it has been around for decades and revised a couple of times. I used a revised version of this model from Dawson, O'Brien, and Beer in 2015, which creates something like a qualitative formula for stress in a workplace. You have demands in the workplace, and your sense of control over these demands can lead to increased or decreased stress. How you perceive these demands. Are they challenges which present an opportunity for you? For a graduate student, this might be like submitting a paper to a journal for the first time and then getting some reviews that you need to, work on it again. But at the end of that, you're going to get a publication and you're excited about it. Demands might be hindrances. Maybe an advisor has an unreasonable amount of hours expected for a student to be in the lab. So how you perceive the job demands, the perceptual element of it is in fact consequential for how much stress it does or doesn't cause. And finally, of course, supports in the workplace can both reduce stress level directly or increase a sense of control and through that decrease stress level. Some examples for graduate students. We're going to wait a couple of slides to see what's on that top row there. But some differences between things that would be perceived as a hindrance versus a challenge. Like I said, a paper revision deadline could be a challenge, or an advisor that has high standards and communicates these well so that the student knows what they're being taught and what they're kind of, pushing towards could be perceived as a challenge. Whereas something perceived as a hindrance could be academic bullying or sudden changes to policy. Some of our qualitative data was collected during the COVID-19 pandemic, so limitations that were totally outside of students' controls were often seen as a hindrance, especially with folks working with biological samples. The other framework that we used, and we invoked this during the analysis, was Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems model. Specifically, I used this as a taxonomy to describe the environment around a graduate student. The idea behind Bronfenbrenner's model, it actually started with childhood development and how children's interactions with people near to them or far away influence their development, but the model has since been applied to students who are older, like teens, and also adults like college students or even graduate students. It's also been used in workplace literature a couple of times as well. Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems model breaks socialized environments into levels as spheres of influence. The closer they are to you, the more influence they have over you, and the more influence you have over them, and the more interaction you have as well. An example for each of the systems and definition is found here. So the closest system, called the microsystem, are people you talk to every day, your family, your friends, your partners, hands-on advisors. In your mesosystem, next out, you might have folks who you don't interact with every day. Imagine you've got a group project in a classroom. You're gonna kind of situationally work closely with these people, but they're not gonna be around always. They might not even be around once you're done with the course. Systems become more abstract as you get further out. Things like governments or institutional policies would be in these further social systems. So I use the idea of proximity to the self as an important tool for characterizing stressors in this qualitative work. And an example here with a little bit of my poor PowerPoint design skills, you can see, starting at the individual and moving into the first three systems, some examples that a typical student might experience as stressors or coping behaviors, as well as supports. So finally, I can get into talking about the study itself. I interviewed and surveyed 55 PhD students over the course of one academic year. This was the 2021 to 2022 academic year, so the COVID pandemic restrictions at the focal institution were very much in place in the first semester, and they started diminishing in the second semester. We intentionally stratified students by a lot of metrics, not just race, gender, LGBT identity, but also the size of the program that students were in, and additionally their stage in program. We tried to have about a third that were before their qualifying exams, between quals and prelims, or after their prelims. And we surveyed and interviewed these students. The surveys happened monthly throughout the course of the main academic year, so not the summer, and the interviews happened every other month. The first was an hour, subsequent ones were 15 minutes. This resulted in 1,400 pages of data, about 80 hours of interviews, and I thematically coded those, which required over 170 codes, and those were captured over 6,000 times. Their stress experiences were described and compared between the survey that they took and the interview responses, which I'll show you pretty soon. Let me start quickly by showing demographics. So again, I tried to intentionally stratify students so that they were as close as I could get to representative of the university I studied at. We also had great participant retention. With 55 people, there were 220 possible interviews. I conducted 212, and there were 440 possible surveys that could have been taken. I conducted 411. So we had 95% cohort retention during the study. So we really did get to see most of these students' experiences throughout the entire academic year. By race, these students were also pretty close to representative of the institution I sampled at. The one exception being we actually had about 8% fewer Asian students than the university had in general, and we also had a slight oversampling of international students. We had about 50-50 across all of the 55 participants. We had 4 coders for the thematic analysis. I coded the entirety of the data set, and a combination of 3 other coders also double coded these, and we compared using a negotiated agreement approach to make sure that we were discussing any discrepancies between the coding scheme. We went with this negotiated agreement approach in part because of stylistic differences between the coders. Some, for example, wanted to highlight individual sentences versus entire paragraphs, and that made iterator reliability counts slightly different when the same material was really being captured. So we reviewed the entire corpus of the data. This was like 2 very intensive weeks of my doctoral advisors and my time to make sure everything was lined up there. The survey analysis I'm actually not going to focus on in this talk, but I'll just highlight that I did descriptive statistics over a couple of measures of student stress level, intention to persist in their program, and anxiety level. I am considering going back to this in my first year as a faculty and doing some latent growth curve analysis over this data, because we do have 8 time points and there's some interesting growth of stress that I could probably look into. Finally, I did a mixed methods analysis between the quantitative and qualitative data, where I had asked students in their final interview to reflectively report the trajectories of their stress levels, and I compared that to the actual stress results from the quantitative surveys to see how well they could reflect on their stress. So let's get into the results. Using a combination of the literature on graduate stressors and also how students were reporting their stress, I identified these topics that could group sources of stress that students were experiencing, ordered by the number of times the categories were applied is on the left, and the top 10 on the right show individual codes within those categories and the number of times those were coded. You will probably not be surprised to find out that what was stressing these engineering grad students out the most was research. Second was advisors. Third was classes. We did ask them to reflect backwards on classes. And a lot of times there were actually through lines of these, for example, balancing all of these. Students who were TAing, taking classes, and doing research at the same time really reported having a lot of struggles with balancing the dimensions of their job. And so we thought that the increased number of demands there was pretty salient. I created an emergent framework from this called the inherency of stressors. I had categorized stressors based on their proximity to the students, how they were describing their perceptions of them, so were these hindrances or challenges, and what sense of control or support did they have over those. But I was finding that trying to describe where the stressors came from wasn't readily captured by most of the theories that I could think of. The 3 categories that I think a lot of stressors doctoral students face could be described like this. Stressors that emerge within the self. This could be ideas that you have about your work, what your work means, your drive to do it, or your interest in it, and also things like your worry internally about your ability. The imposter phenomenon would belong here. And the other 2 stressors are things that are external, and I called them stressors that are inherent to the undertaking of a PhD and stressors that are not inherent. And what I mean by that is there are some stressors that every graduate student should expect to run into to try to find a way to deal with, and there are ones that they shouldn't. If you enroll in a graduate program, you know that you are going to produce novel research. You know that you are going to need to balance classes and research for the first couple of years. You're going to have to take your quals. You're going to have to defend a thesis. This is part of the graduate experience. It is not necessarily ideal that all of this is present, and some of the work that Karen and I are doing about stress cultures in engineering really have a lot to say about the fact that maybe there is more stress than there ought to be. But for now, there are certain expectations in academia that just about everybody runs into. But then there are stressors that are not inherent. These are difficult to control and difficult to prepare for. If you experience bullying or harassment, if suddenly your lab runs out of funding, if you have a really bad instructor who has unfair grading policies, this is different from student to student. You can't come in and expect that this is going to happen to everybody else. You can try to prepare for it, but when it comes to who's facing the stressor, it is not going to be this sort of like unique experience across students. And we thought that distinguishing these 2 is very important. So if I bring these 3 models together to describe a stressor qualitatively, I classify it first by its source as a self-inherent or not inherent stressor, then using the JHCA's framework, describe how it's perceived and the degree of control or support one has over the stressor. And finally, looking again at the source of the stressor, describe its proximity to a participant within their environment. Here's 2 case examples. We had a participant who needed to find an advisor by the end of their first year, or they couldn't continue in their program. That was a policy that their department had. This was an international student who did not communicate with potential advisors before coming to the program and actually didn't know that that was a norm. And so they came, they were not paired with an advisor. They were told that they had to do this by the end of their first year. And in their first interview, they were very stressed out because they had not yet matched with an advisor. They had attended one advisor's lab group meetings, didn't think it was a good fit, and they were kind of worrying, like, should I do this thing that I don't want to do because I might have to leave? This policy would apply to every student in this department. So it is probably an inherent stressor to these students, and could have been perceived as a hindrance to some students and a challenge to others, depending on the information that they had as they came in. For the student that I interviewed, this was seen as a hindrance stressor. And further, that student, because they didn't have this information coming in, they had little power to control it. One reason the student really couldn't control this is they can't change the policy. The policy emerges from something that's more like a departmental structure and less like a person that you interact with, so it's not proximal in Bronfenbrenner's system. Here's another example. Let's say you experience a microaggression within your lab group. This is a not inherent stressor. Like I said, it shouldn't be ubiquitously expected among students, and in fact, it probably depends a lot on your identity as the student if you are or aren't experiencing these microaggressions, especially when they're based on gender or race. This is likewise seen by participants who described microaggressions as hindrances, but in this case, a lot of people did describe a sense of control, switching advisors. One person relocated to a national lab for several years of their PhD and worked with a different supervisor. And I think one of the reasons you have this more control is because you have more proximal interactions to an advisor or to a lab mate who is causing the microaggression. That does not mean it's easy or comfortable to solve these problems, but it does mean that you typically would have more of a sense of influence. In general, I found three trends qualitatively between these frameworks. Stressors that were not inherent were typically considered as bigger hindrances, and I think I've described pretty well so far why that would be true. More proximal stressors allow for more control, so relationships that you influence on a daily level or multiple times throughout a semester are easier to work with. And not inherent stressors are more proximal. We did not have many people having non-ubiquitous experiences that would have affected a lot of people at like an institutional level. There are some examples of not inherent stressors that are not proximal. This could look, for example, like a policy changing that only targets students of a certain demographic. And so that would not be expected for all students, but it would not come from a source that's very close to you. And in fact, we had a lot of people talking about some political changes that happened in 2022 that did describe those kinds of not inherent and not proximal stressors. So I said earlier that I compared the two. I think this is really cool. We had 8 surveys on psychometric stress level, and in the last interview over Zoom, we asked people to verbally describe a plot of their stress levels. We used some very strict rules to code these and actually draw trajectories that represented what the students described, and then we compared these two plots qualitatively. Here's a couple of examples. Participant 147, a little bit difficult to read these quotes, but these are direct quotes from the interviews. They said their stress started very high in August. They had back-to-back hospital visits. Their stress then decreased. And they said they were still experiencing pretty high stress, but they were probably the happiest that they had been in a time as they left for break in January. And then they described that their stress increased directly as they returned to the semester, and it's kind of been petering out since. The rules that we used for this is anytime participants did not describe a shape to the graph, we used a straight line. That's why you see this kind of vertical asymptote there. And we asked them to describe higher or lower stress. Some people gave a direct type of plot. We heard somebody say sinusoid, we heard somebody say Gaussian, but a lot of people didn't, and so many of these plots looked like straight lines that had discontinuous jumps up or down at certain months. Every word that appears on these plots came from the interview. So if there's an x-axis label like August or January, that's directly from the interview. Let's compare now with their actual responses to the DAS-21 at each time point. They had very low stress in the first period, but otherwise their stress did jump up to a higher level, decrease in the survey that they took in January, and then petered out a bit after that. So this is close, but not quite accurate. And the October data point in particular is a little bit different from what they described as having higher stress at the start of the semester. Here's another participant. As you can see, they didn't describe a lot of shapes, so we have straight lines. They described good and normal stress at the start. This is a first-year participant. And then they described rising stress to their highest point, in which they got COVID right when finals were happening in their first semester. And they described a really challenging situation there. Like the other student, they described a diminishment in stress during break. And then they said that they were handling their workload better. They didn't give us much details about their spring semester. Let's compare again. And you can see that this person did identify correctly that they had really low stress at the start that kind of peaked over. They took their survey the very end of January and very beginning of February. So there's a little bit of a kind of close together. We gave them all month to take the surveys. If I went back again, I think I would give them like a more limited perspective, like a week in the middle of the month. But this is relatively close compared to the first participant. And what we found across all of them is that in general, for a majority of participants, the following things were true. The maxima and minima of the stress graphs qualitatively described retroactively across a year and that they took in real time each month tended to agree. The number of inflection points was typically similar. And I think that there's pretty good evidence that students are keen on retroactive assessments of their stress levels. A lot of times, I think when we survey students, we ask for their stress now. We don't necessarily ask for their stress in the last 6 months or the last year. But I think there's a lot of evidence to say that students can accurately, qualitatively, and quantitatively describe and reflect on their stress levels. There was a lot of overlap, though not perfect overlap, between these two. One thing to keep in mind is this is 8 time points of quantitative data collected on a single day. It could have been a better day or a worse day in the month. But in general, there was a lot of overlap between the shapes, which leads me to believe that there's some good use in using repeated time measurements to describe stress, or even asking students at one time point to ask about their stress now, a month ago, 6 months ago. I want to talk about time for a second here too. I don't have a slide on this, but I think this is an important finding. The top stressors described by students changed between their interviews. This probably doesn't surprise you, but it does have implications on how we measure stress. There are seasonal cycles of exams. In the middle of the semester, you're probably going to be stressed about midterms if you're taking classes. But if you're a late-stage PhD student, you're not taking classes. So you're probably worried about writing or research or maybe preparing for a prelim or a thesis defense. There are, again, increased within semester cycles of midterms and finals, but across the whole academic year, you might be taking milestones at the end of the year. That was pretty common in a lot of the engineering departments we interviewed from, where, for example, at the end of the first year, they might take a qualifying exam. They might have a deadline to take their prelim by the end of their 4th year. So there were yearly cycles, there were semesterly cycles. There's also annual cycles on the year's calendar. A lot of people in our winter interviews, so the second and the third ones, described struggling to go to the gym or go out and walk because of the weather. We had a pretty severe winter in February, which is when the third interviews happened. And so these participants described, really struggling to access some of the resources that they would like to use. And so I think the key implication here is that cross-sectional research of stress might not be that reliable. If you survey on the day of finals, or if you survey 3 weeks before, you could get wildly different results in top stressors. So I think longitudinal research is really paramount when it comes to how you look at stress for anybody in any setting, a workplace or undergraduate or graduate programs. That's the end of this section. I want to pause for a second. I can take maybe 1 to 2 questions before I keep going. Are there any in the chat, or is there anyone?
You do? Oh, yeah. So if you're in the chat, they can unmute or put it in the chat. Yeah.
For me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I want to say great job, Joe. You've given an amazing presentation. I'm learning a lot. I was curious, you talked about finding that for students, they were pretty good at retroactively describing what their stress levels are. How can that actually be applied to making suggestions for how students can use that to support themselves or how we could support students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can think of a couple of things in mind. This is the most important and maybe the most simple. If a student tells you that they've been stressed out, you should trust them. They are the most accurate instrument of knowing their own stress levels because they are the ones who are experiencing it. And I've shown some evidence that they can retroactively say, I've been stressed out as well as I am stressed out. I think in terms of supporting students, one really important thing is to, have grace and recognize that students are identifying the times that are hardest for them. And that is when, they need our support the most. From a more research-oriented standpoint, I think that this has implications for how we measure stress. I think, like I said, you don't just have to measure stress at one time point. You could ask people to reflect back on it, and I think that that's a trustworthy approach to doing that research. I would say also there's a lot of validity to using both longitudinal qualitative and longitudinal quantitative approaches at stress, and doing those either at one time point where you ask people to reflect back or by repeated measurements. And so I guess the kind of challenge that I have for folks and that experienced myself when I did this was to say, is it a good idea to just measure something at one time when you talk to people, or would it actually be a more complete picture if you asked people in a couple of different ways how they were experiencing the same thing? Does that get to your question pretty well? I turn it around.
That was an excellent response and very comprehensive. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Anyone have one other quick question before I keep moving? All right. Let me talk about where the study went from here. I developed a survey to attempt to measure some of these main categories of stressors that appeared qualitatively in the first study. This survey was called the SDSQE, which stands for the Stressors for Doctoral Students Questionnaire in Engineering. These are the 11 subscales within the 65-item survey that I developed, and you'll see that they match perfectly onto that slide I gave earlier with some of the qualitative results. With the exception of we moved a couple of stressors into one category because we wanted to have enough items, specifically campus life and finances. Qualitatively, we had described these as a little bit of separate things. There were issues that had to do with groceries and having a car, and there were issues that had to do with the size of a graduate stipend. But we actually, on reflection, thought that these things were probably closely related to finances in general, and so we put them together as one subscale. For each subscale, we developed about 3 to 5 items, and then I conducted cognitive interviews with 13 PhD student participants. One pretty cool thing is, in addition to refining the SDSQ, we also use this for member checking. So I invited 5 participants to come back from the 55 who I had interviewed and cognitively interview on this survey and respond if they thought that the themes within the survey and the individual questions were indicative of their experiences. And I actually was able to get some participants to come back who had different types of top stressors. I had one person who had really, really bad course stressors, and she read a question. She's like, Joe, is this from me? And so that was a good moment in the member checking. Sorry, not 5 participants, 7 participants were from the first year. And I picked some of the major stressors. I had someone with pretty big advisor issues. I had someone with lab and research issues. As some of the top stressors they had described in their interviews, come back and look at those sections specifically. I iteratively improved the survey after each cognitive interview so that I didn't have to hear some issues like multiple times. So for example, if somebody was like, that needs a comma, I don't need to hear that from multiple participants. I fixed it right then. For a couple of other issues, like somebody was like, I don't know if this question's working, I let somebody else hear it and said in the interview, the last participant who took this wasn't too sure about this. What did you think? And so one thing I really like about the cognitive interview process is that you can be reflexive and actually like a little bit semi-structured with the interviews to iterate through your survey and not do the same thing each time, so you can be very intentional. And I also really like that the cognitive interviews are a very like participant action-focused method in which the participants are actually helping you build the survey. And so bringing them in and getting their feedback, especially when they had done a longitudinal study on this already and cared about the topic, was a really valuable experience. I'm going to go kind of quickly through the analysis of the survey. I did an exploratory factor analysis on the survey and found 11 subscales grouped by stressors. I did a descriptive analysis, and I also looked at the reliability of factors. I looked at differences in responses based on demographic subgroups. I looked at correlations between the items and the factors. And the pilot survey of this was given at 2 windows, a fall and a spring semester distribution, again, following those lessons that I had learned during the qualitative portion of this work, and I compared the two. I'm actually not going to show everything from the results there, but I'm happy to talk about them after or answer questions. But I want to point out that we used Likert scales that both measured the frequency and severity of stressors because we were not sure if those would be different. Let me use the same example I've been using about a not inherent microaggression stressor. Maybe that happened once. Maybe your advisor said one thing that like really like hurt and intimidated you. Do you ruminate about that a lot? And so it's quite a severe stressor, but is it an infrequent stressor because it only happened once? I wasn't totally sure. And so for each item, there were actually 2 questions. One that said, how frequently does this stressor occur? And another that says, how severe is that stressor? And the 2 portions had really high correlations. They were about, on average, a 0.84 correlation between the 2. This is the reliability, not the correlations up there, but just to show that using both Cronbach's alpha and an SEM-based McDonald's omega approach, these were highly reliable subscales. And in fact, I also did a bifactor rotation, and there was a pretty strong loading general factor that described all items as well. In the future, because these 2 ways of measuring the frequency and the severity of stressors were so highly correlated, we're actually only going to use the simpler severity scale, which has fewer Likert type options. The other thing I want to highlight here, because I've talked a little bit about the longitudinal results, are the changes between the means and the standard deviations in the spring and the fall. And one thing that you'll notice is that a lot of these means actually jumped up or down between these stressors. And so, for example, on the first column here, you've got the mean across the sample, and then on the 3rd and the 5th columns, you have in the fall and the spring. Advisor-related issues were much higher in the fall than in the spring. Now, some of this could be a little bit of an artifact of the fact that we had 2 different samples at these 2 different time points. Maybe there were folks with a little bit worse advisors, but we did do Cohen's d effect size estimates, and we got a small to moderate effect size for each of these. And so there's likely statistical significance within that. Similarly, the campus and finance-related stressors were stronger in the fall than in the spring, as were the class-related stressors. And so I think you do see a little bit of these, living in town, being part of the graduate experience stressors diminish over the course of an academic year as folks kind of acclimate to their programs and start to build strategies. And in fact, if you continue going down the board, these means across participant groups decreased almost entirely between the fall and the spring. A little bit too many times for me to think that this is possibly like just an artifact. So I think when you measure stress, again, I just want to hammer in this point, you're getting a different result depending on what cross-sectional approach you use. So in the middle of the fall semester versus in the middle of the spring semester, we saw almost all of these subscales decrease in terms of the level of stress, which probably means that these time points are measuring, slightly different parts of a graduate experience. Even if you let students be grouped based on what year they're in, there is a change from one time to another. And so trying to identify a top stressor at a single time point or trying to diagnose the overall culture or stress level people are facing at a single time point is probably not a good approach. I also want to highlight another project that I'm working on just shortly at the end of this, which is that with Karen Jensen, we have actually been working on the exact same thing, but for undergraduate students. So we published some qualitative work on undergraduate student stressors, coping strategies, and experiences with culture. And then we did a pilot survey of a new engineering stress culture scale with about 600 undergraduate students. And at a second institution, we have been longitudinally sampling students taking this scale as well as a suite of other metrics. We're planning on using mixture modeling and factor analysis to make sure we fully develop these scales and then also look at their trends over time. And I just want to highlight, I'm going to skip ahead to the plots because I think this is quite interesting. Student stress levels actually become much less similar throughout the course of time point to time point, going from the bottom of the plot and up as increasing time. And you can see that stress scores have this interesting within semester pattern. So every 2 is within a semester. The first one tends to be a little bit flatter and more Gaussian-like, while the second tends to have slightly bimodal distributions. We haven't quite teased out why that is, but one thing that could be happening is these time points twice measured per semester might be happening before and after midterms. There might be folks who have done well or adapted well between the two or not, but you really see that the distribution shape seems to change based on time. So again, this idea of cross-sectional measurement of stress levels, maybe not telling a complete picture of what's going on is here. Our new scale that measures perceptions of engineering stress culture, this is an idea that high stress is normalized, that toxic overwork is expected of students. The endorsements of those actually began to form tighter distributions as the semester goes on and as the years go on. And an interesting feature of this is that we're actually losing, about 5 to 10% of participants between time points to attrition, but still the distribution shape is narrowing quite a bit. And so I think we're measuring a process of acculturation to engineering as a stressful discipline. I'll pause there. And actually, there's only about 10 minutes left, and I don't have much in the future plans section. Why don't I run through the end really quick?
Don't say that in your job, John.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of ideas for the future, but no, I'm still hammering out the timing a little bit. But as I carry on my research into faculty work, there's a couple of things that I'd really like to do. First of all, engineering stress culture. This is a new construct that Karen and I have been working on, and I'd like to continue comparing what the meaning of the construct is to other measures. So for example, if you endorse that it is normal for people to be highly stressed across your engineering program, what does that say about how you experience your own psychometrics of mental health? What does that say about your satisfaction within programs or your career intentions? I'd like to look at some of those things in the future. On the graduate student side, I'd like to look a little bit at some nuances in how students describe attrition. I'd like to also do some intervention work. I've been experimenting with methods. I showed a little bit of the stress trajectories, and actually in another project, we've had the participants draw those directly. I've also been using AI tool use in education research, semantic network analysis for breaking qualitative data down into something that can be a little bit more closely measured with quantitative metrics, and also mixture modeling and some deeper longitudinal study designs. And what I'd really like to do first is take some of these instruments that I've constructed as a graduate student and postdoc, use them within an institution to identify top stressors, and then start doing intervention work specifically on those stressors. So the first grants I want to write as a faculty member will be 2-phase projects. In the first phase, I'll be using these scales that I've developed to identify top issues. And then in the second phase of these, I'll be finding ways to intervene on improving these. This might look like a second phase that has faculty training grants, maybe counseling interventions and getting paired with some university counselors. and also maybe using some quasi-experimental techniques. For example, changing a policy, doing an interrupted time series design on collecting stress levels for a couple of years before and after. And then finally, I haven't taught in a minute, but I'm excited to teach again. And I want to really center wellness and community in my classrooms and draw from folks that I have worked with on ideas there. Want to give a quick acknowledgement to the PIs on this project. Karen and my doctoral advisor, Jennifer Cromley, are in the first picture. And in the center on the right one is Liz Litzler, the evaluator for our project. And also my many mentors and research friends at Illinois in the Thrive Lab and in my past in physics, some of whom are pictured here on the slides. If I did not have a picture of you, I'm very sorry, but you're in my heart still. Thank you very much, and I'll take some time for questions. Or feedback.
If you have a question and you're in the audience, we're going to bring the microphone around. Okay.
I can see you.
Yes, you do. So the people on Zoom.
So you mentioned doing the study again for undergraduates and to get a I guess a survey.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have an idea of the different stressors, I'm sorry, that may be seen in undergraduate areas that we're not necessarily thinking about, or if there are any similarities as well.
That's a wonderful question. And yes, absolutely. We used a very similar approach to build both surveys, which was conduct interviews and review the literature, use those to kind of think of like a space of what all of the stressors are, not just that are commonly reported in the literature, but specifically to start at a focal institution, what students there were describing, and that's how we built both surveys. And at the undergraduate level, there's a couple of things. So class stressors, way at the top. Definitely the most important thing. They are still present at the graduate level, so we had subscales for classroom stressors in both, but there's kind of two parts to answer your question. One is that there are some stressors that are present that aren't across the two levels, like milestones aren't really present for undergrads, but we had stressors related to the prestige of the institution at the two institutions we sampled that were not really reflected in the graduate students. So saying things like, I go to this institution, it's a top institution, I need to be at my best because like I'm among the best, was something that students said in the interviews quite a bit. And so we developed a scale that was for prestige stressors for undergrads. So there's the existence of the stressors, but also I think if you order them by ranking of what have the highest means and not, it's quite different as well. So classes are at the top for undergraduates. These prestige stressors are there. There was so much stuff about classes that we made two scales. One is about competition versus peers and like comparing yourself to peers. So some of these might be like self-initiated stressors, like I'm not doing as well as the people around me, or I don't think I'm like cut out for this. And some of these might be like exams are difficult, you know, so more conventional what you think of when you hear classroom stressors. So yes, I think we found both different stressors present between graduate and undergraduate students, and also different orderings of what the top stressors are.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay. So in your first study, you talked about control and like the different stressors and how much control the students may have over them. And I appreciated your use of may or could rather than, how much they do have control over them. I was curious if that is like your assessment of control or if that is students telling you how much control they perceive themselves to have.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the JHCS framework was our theoretical framework a priori. So it was used in the design of the interviews. We realized that we needed another framework to explain what was going on. So at the stage of the analysis, we added Bronfenbrenner in and then did a like grounded theory development of the inherency framework. because JHCS was there right from the start and is like our primary framing, we actually did ask how much control students had directly. So we did have answers from that, like right from the get-go. So we used a semi-structured design. We basically didn't prompt students with stressors to start, and we said, what stresses you out? And then we followed up with questions that were like, how much stress does this cause you? How much do you feel like you can control this? Like, when is it highest or lowest? Depending on how much time there was in the conversation was going. And then we went back and probed on individual categories of stressors after that. And some people were like, oh yeah, I didn't think of this, but yeah, this stresses me out. And then we'd ask the same follow-ups. So that's a long answer to say that yes, we did. I was reporting how students described having the control.
Okay, cool. No, I think that's helpful to know, because perceptions of control, I almost think, are as important or more important as like the actual details of like how the university or department system is set up, you know.
Yeah.
Because you could technically have control, but not feel like you have control. And I would imagine that is what's important.
Yeah, and then there are situations where you technically don't have control but feel like you do. Like I prepared well for this exam, you know. So definitely there's like a lot of nuance between the lines there, and that's why I may and could statements and trends is really the strongest that I feel like I can say, and also the strongest anyone can say.
Oh no! Oh, lost the bell.
So
Oh, no.
for the drawings based off of the interview, did you go back to the participants and say, does this look how you feel, or was this just totally based off of like their verbals, right?
It was based off their verbals, so we did not member check that, which is why in a follow-up study we had participants draw them themselves, because we thought that was more reliable. So I think, you know, something I might do down the line is maybe like make an instructive conference presentation, like here's these two methods, and like we tried this the first time and we realized you have to do these things and we did these things, and this is now something that like any mixed methodologist could do. But yeah, we did not member check the first set. We just used a very strict set of rules to go through those and compare them to the stress levels. But in a second study, this is something that Karen and I and Eileen Johnson, who's one of Karen's grad students, have been working on. We had participants draw them themselves, but we have a more coarse quantitative data to compare them to. So we might focus more on just the drawings that they've had and matching those to quotes in the interviews as our mixing of methods.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joe, for your presentation, and let's thank Joe again, and please feel free to grab some more snacks too. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay tuned for our next seminar speaker, Dr. Johnson, next month.
And please sign in if you haven't signed in.
Thank you.